Hello everyone, my name is Peter, and in today's Scratch tutorial we're going to be going over how to make a two-player soccer game. So each player is going to be controlled by either WASD or arrow keys, and the players are going to be able to kick the ball back and forth until one of them scores, and then they will be awarded a point. So to get started, we're going to make the controls, and to do this, I made a function called WASD controls. Now this is for the player on the left because I want them to be controlled by WASD. So in this, I check if the keys W, A, S, and D are pressed, and I change each Y or X by this variable I have called player speed. So player speed is just one of the variables I've created, and I use a variable to set this speed because it makes it a lot easier when you want to change how slow or fast the player wants to go. That way, if you decide to change it to make it faster or slower, you can change it only once in here instead of having to change the player speed every single time in all of these blocks. So in this function, it's basically pretty simple where with W pressed, the Y will be changed by player speed. S, it changes the Y by player speed times -1, which is just the negative player speed. If A is pressed, it changes the X by player speed times -1, which moves it to the left. And then D changes X by player speed, which moves it to the right. So with that, that makes our character move up, down, left, and right using W, A, S, and D. So now into our actual loop here, which we repeat until this can move variable equals to 0, and I'll get into what that does later. So first we have this if else, and basically what this checks is if the player is touching the ball, then it wants to switch the costume to kicking, and if it's not touching the ball, then switch it to standing. So these are the two costumes that I have, which are kicking and standing. And what the code does is if the player is touching the ball, it should look like the player is kicking the ball, so then it'll switch to this costume. But if the player is not touching the ball, then it's going to switch to the standing costume because it's not touching it. Now finally we have this if x position is less than 15 or x position equal to or less than or equal to -15, then we set x to -15. Now this makes it so the player on the left here, which is our red player, can only stay on his half of the screen. So if you want to move anywhere past -15, you can't get past, since that would be a bit unfair if you were able to go onto your opponent's side. And finally we have if on edge bounce and point in direction 90, which just makes sure our player is just constantly standing straight up the whole time. So with that, we basically have the basics of moving our character around and switching around the costumes. And for the blue character, it's pretty much the same thing, except we use arrow keys to control him, and he's facing the opposite direction, so he can only stay on the right side of the screen. So after we have that, we have to make our goals, which are pretty simple. We first have our red goal, and we have our blue goal here. And all they do is just set the score to 0 as soon as the game starts. Now we can look at the ball. Now the ball has to bounce around and bounce off the players themselves. So there's a whole bunch of loops here that show how exactly that works, and I'll get into that right now. Starting here at the when flag clicked, the ball first sets the speed to 10, which is how fast it will move, and then it goes to the center of the screen at 0, 0. Now here, this code just makes it pick randomly from which angle it wants to start at when it starts out. So it can either go from 30 to 150 or -150 to -30. And I do this because sometimes the ball just, if you set a random angle, it just bounces way too low or high, and it makes it really hard to hit. So this makes it so that the angle is just right, and it hits either to the red player or the blue player, and not some random angle. So now in this big chunk of code over here, we have repeat until touching red goal or touching blue goal. So basically the ball is going to bounce around until it's touching one of the two goals. And as long as it's not touching one of them, it's going to continue to bounce around. So the code in here is if touching red or touching blue, then we want to bounce off the player. So if we hit the red player, we want to bounce in the opposite direction, and the same thing for the blue player, since we want them to look like it's actually kicking the ball. And in order to do that, we do this code down here. And it's a bit complicated, so I'll explain it step by step. First, we have if direction is less than 0. And direction is this block down here, and it's the actual angle of the ball. Now we have a new variable called direction, and we call it the same thing because technically it is, but we want to make it positive. So if the ball's direction is less than 0, we set our variable direction to the ball's direction plus 360. And that works because when the angle of the ball is negative and you add 360 to it, the result is just the positive angle. So after we have that, we can set our other variable called turn degrees, which is how much we want the ball to turn when it hits the player, and we can set it to 360 minus direction plus a random number from -10 to +10. And if I take this apart, you can see these two are separate. So this one goes in the first block here, and this one goes in the second one. And we do this pick random because we wanted to make it a little bit adjustments, like when the ball is kicked, so it's not perfectly straight the whole time. And this 360 minus direction basically makes it so when the ball is like headed towards a player at a certain angle, it'll just bounce off in the opposite angle. So now if the ball is touching red, we're going to turn in turn degrees, point in direction turn degrees, and when the ball is touching blue, we point in direction turn degrees times -1. That way, when it's touching red, it's going to bounce off it, and when it's touching blue, it's going to bounce off in the opposite direction. And the most important part here is the point in direction block. If we used another block like turn however many degrees, it wouldn't work the same way because turning constantly turns the ball whenever it's touching the actual player. But if we do point in direction, you can only point in direction once, since once you point in that direction, you're going to be constantly pointing in it. That way it doesn't change and spin around a bunch of times. Finally, we have move ball speed steps, which is just however fast the ball is going to move, and then if on edge bounce. So that way, if it's on the edge, it'll just bounce right off. Now down here, we have the actual scoring. So if the ball is touching red goal or the ball is touching the blue goal, we're just going to broadcast this message and then change the respective score, either blue or red. So now we have this message here, broadcast reset. Now what this does is broadcast the message and it lets the whole game know that the game is reset. So basically when I receive reset down here, it just resets the game and puts the ball back into the center. And if we go back to our players, when I receive reset, it goes to the -100, 0, and then it switches the costume to standing. So finally we have this last part, which is just the sign that starts the game, so like the ready, set, go sign. And for this one, it's pretty simple. It's just a bunch of costumes where it's ready, go, and then whoever team scores, so red or blue. For this, all it does is say ready, set, or ready, go in the first when you first start the game, and then it sets the previous red score and previous blue score to the whatever red score and blue score are. And we use these previous because in this reset part, when I receive reset, it compares if the red score or the blue score has increased at all. So if the previous score is lower than the red score, then we know red has scored and we can award a point to red. Otherwise, we know blue has scored and then they can get a point. So now when either team has scored, it just says whichever team won, and then it sets the previous score and previous scores to the scores that just got scored. So basically, when red scores or blue scores, it's just going to set the previous red score and previous blue score to red score and blue score. That way it is up to date on whichever score is for each team. So after we have all that, we can take a look at how it actually runs. So it starts out with the players just kicking the balls back and forth, and we can see what happens when one team scores. So I can just make one team score. Just give it a while to score. And then there we have blue scores since blue made that goal. And then it keeps repeating until you can determine whenever you want it to stop. But for this one, it just goes on and on. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this tutorial. You can also add a backdrop if you want. I just made it a simple soccer field. And yeah, so if there are any questions or if you guys have any other ideas, you can put them in the comments. If there's nothing else, then yep. I hope you guys liked the video. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.